So welcome to session 4 of the conference. We've got some exciting speakers for our Flash Talk section. And as usual, we will ask you to please write your questions on the Padlet and we'll ask questions at the end. All presenters' bios and details of any co-researchers can be found in the abstract book. Okay, get ready for a fast round of wonderful anthrozoological research. First to present is André Christopher Crozier, who recently began his PhD candidature at Central Queensland University, and he will be talking about exploring the significance of collectivism and individualism in human attachment and empathy towards pets.
I'm one of those people who are just crazy about their pets. And like many other pet enthusiasts, I treat my pets like they're human. I'll talk about them to anyone who'll listen. And there is very possibly an unhealthy number of pictures of them on my phone. So being ever curious about the psychology underpinning the human-animal bond and interaction, the aim of my project was to characterize the relationship between culture and the attachment and empathy owners had for their animals. Although we don't fully understand if the attachment and empathy we have for our pets are the same as those we have for other humans, we do know two things. First, we know that similarities exist between these parallel constructs. For example, regardless of species, we can grow to love those close to us and to feel sad when we're apart from them. Second, we also know that the development of human attachment and empathy is significantly influenced by our culture. Culture is complex and can be studied in many different ways. Based on preference and parsimony, the framework I chose to use in my study was the individualism and collectivism paradigm. At its most basic, the model describes individualists as having an I mindset and focusing on personal goals, while it describes collectivists as having a we mindset and focusing on group objectives. Hence, I hypothesized that when compared to individualists, collectivists would show higher attachment and empathy towards their pets. I also hypothesized that individualistic and collectivistic tendencies were predictive of pet attachment and empathy. So I gathered my data through an anonymous online survey, but the analysis of the responses I received was somewhat surprising because, contrary to my hypotheses, the results showed that the different groups were actually equally attached and empathetic to their pets. The results also showed that pet attachment and empathy could not be predicted by individualism and collectivism. Now, while these outcomes could be interpreted as a lack of association between the variables, there are also alternative explanations available. For instance, I used a two-dimensional model of individualism and collectivism, which, although suitable for studying human-to-human relationships, may have been unable to detect nuances in human-to-animal relationships. This would suggest that human-to-animal attachment and empathy are different from the human-to-human versions of these constructs. In addition, I had also not placed heavy emphasis on the geographic origins and locations of my participants. And as we know that cultural differences can also be heavily influenced by geography, it would have been beneficial for me to have done so because considering these data could have added a further dimension to the analyses and my outcomes. So regardless, my study was both exploratory and novel, and further research is no doubt required to confirm what I found and to deepen our understanding of this topic. But what my study can do right now, though, is provide a starting point on which future investigations can be based. And before I end, I would just like to acknowledge the support and guidance of my supervisor, Dr. Tina McCaddy, and the contribution of my own pets, whose pictures I use for the actual advertisement for this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions about that that you can answer later. But for now, we're moving on to Lux Profus, I hope I've said that correctly, who has a master's degree in criminology from the University of Warsaw in Poland. And Lux will be talking about the roles and fate of animals in the war in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you very much, Lux.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Lux, and let's start already because we don't have so much time. It is important to remember that whether there is war or peace, non-human animals always have lower rights and protections than humans, which is often overlooked, and they are also affected more and unnoticed by war discourse. That is why I would like to briefly discuss some of the problems that affects animal at war. The situation of animals at war is difficult in that they are completely unable to understand human conflicts, yet they are fully involved in them, just as they are victims to human mechanism in peacetime. For animals, there is no concept of state, borders, or war, yet they are also became victims of it and suffer real losses. It happens that people nevertheless take their pets with them and try to cross the borders with them. This happened to many Ukrainian citizens who took their dogs and cats with them when fleeing the Russian invasion. Unfortunately, if animals do get rescued during the war, they are usually only dogs and cats, treated by people as family members. When it comes to animals living on farms, they are not so fortunate, and this is due to two things: less sympathy to them by people, and the fact they are too big or there are too many of them to carry them across the border. This division shows the reality that applies to animals in peacetime as well. They are not treated equally by humans. Some are given the status of friends or family members, and others serve the function of an object or property, and that's the reason for different approaches to their evacuation. The article Silence Victims of War by Hanna Mazurek recalls a narrative that often appears in war, namely language, which speaks of the animalization of people in war as a term for primitive and cruel behavior, the opposite of which is supposed to be humanism in the broadest sense. Meanwhile, animals in war persist in a role even worse than the most civilians, because their nightmare continues all at times. It doesn't matter if there is war or peace, and when war does come, the rescue comes at the very end, if at all. We can see examples of this, the fate of animals living at the zoos, farms, and even forests who are involved in war. An example is the chicken farm in Czarnobayevka, which even before the war was a place of great injustice, where the animals were exploited and killed every day, and when the supply of feed to hens was cut off due to the war, the animals starved to death. And the article War is Also Hell for Animals by Katarzyna Przyborska says that although the procedures for transporting chickens, pigs, or cows from a country of war make it possible to help them, it is much harder due to epidemiological diseases, and although few animals manage to cross borders in this way, millions of animals remain, and these animals are not granted any refugee status. The fate of animals in zoos is very similar. Often they are abandoned because the area has been covered by war and the animals themselves are too large to evacuate. Locked in the cages, they can only wait to die of starvation unless they die beforehand from shell damage or became food for soldiers. During Russia's current invasion of Ukraine, Russian soldiers, deprived of provisions, ate some of the animals from Ukrainian zoo. And one of the more shocking examples was a kangaroo, which is often cited to show their dehumanization, since eating a certain type of animal is considered abnormal, while other can be eaten on a regular basis. And of course, the situation of trapped animals is tragic, but it's not particularly different from the situation of those that are killed every day in a peacetime. So the conclusion is, I believe that war illustrates animal abuse, but it starts much earlier in a peacetime. For many kinds of animals, war is eternal. It's their everyday life. So we need to completely change our treatment of animals in a peacetime if we want to help them in a wartime. So that's all. Thank you very much. I know it was pretty short, but I am actually afraid to speak in English, and it was my first not Polish conference. So thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant, and your English was fantastic. If that was your first your first English conference, it was absolutely great. And the subject matter is something that's very dear to my heart, and I would like to talk to you again in the future about that. But for now, we just have to move on to the next presentation. But if anybody has any questions, either remember to raise your hand at the end or put your questions in the Padlet. Okay, so now we're moving on to Mallorie Pelzer, who is a spring 2023 graduate from Canisius College with an MSc in Anthrozoology. And Mallorie will be talking about Identities Born and Chosen, an interpretive phenomenological study of the lived experience of people who identify as LGBTQ and ethical vegans. Sorry. Okay, Mallorie, thank you.
So, as she said, my study was entitled Identities Born and Chosen. So this study explored the lived experience of individuals who self-identify as both part of the LGBTQ+ community and as ethical vegans. Utilizing an interpretative phenomenological approach, the study aimed to answer the questions: what is the lived experience of LGBTQ+ individuals that have adopted ethical veganism, and how do these two aspects of identity interact with one another? 12 volunteers participated in semi-structured one-on-one interviews, which were transcribed and thematically analyzed to produce 3 primary themes. The first one being language, definitions, and assigned meanings. The second being shared experiences in LGBTQ+ and vegan identities. And the third being factors influencing variations in experienced acceptance. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing on the second and third themes, but essentially with the first theme, much of the conversations that were held involved defining and explaining what certain terms meant for the participants. That included how they felt others define certain terms, how they themselves define certain terms, and how discussions around their identities were typically held. So among the experiences that were described by participants, there was a lot of overlap between their LGBTQ+ identities and their vegan identities, resulting in the second theme of shared experiences. All of the sub-themes are listed, however, I'll only be speaking on the most frequent themes, which are ones highlighted in blue. So incredibly common topics throughout the interviews were the concepts of self-acceptance, confidence, and authenticity. Each of these was spoken of in reference to both the LGBTQ+ and the vegan identities. Some participants described how they needed to learn how to not need outward acceptance, how to rely on themselves for that acceptance, and how having these two identities taught them a lot about accepting themselves for who they are despite a lack of support from others. And then these feelings of self-acceptance and confidence brought along feelings of authenticity and an understanding behind the importance of overcoming internalized homophobia and other internal biases. Another prominently shared experience between the two identities was the concept of valuing empathy, compassion, and equality for all living beings. These values were repeatedly expressed by 9 of the 12 participants in terms of both their motivations for adopting ethical veganism and their experiences within the LGBTQ+ community. Participants expressed how both of these identities allowed them to see different people, species, and living beings in general as good and deserving of love and respect. While it was understood that there was no causal relationship between their LGBTQ+ and vegan identities, participants generally expressed how the two did pair well together or coexist nicely. Although there were many aspects of these identities that resulted in shared experiences, there were also many factors that resulted in variations between how the two identities are experienced. Particularly, these factors altered participants' perceived and experienced levels of acceptance surrounding their LGBTQ+ and vegan identities, bringing us to the third theme of factors influencing variations in perceived acceptance. The main factor influencing participants' experience acceptance was the level of understanding had by those around them. Most often when participants described not being accepted by other individuals, they stated that the lack of acceptance appeared to be a result of a lack of understanding and an abundance of confusion, surrounding their LGBTQ+ and vegan identity. 8 of the 12 participants mentioned a religious affiliation or political perspective when explaining why they felt like their identities weren't accepted by certain individuals in their lives. And commonly, participants experienced a lack of acceptance through invalidation and avoidance. They would often have others tell them that they were wrong for being LGBTQ plus or for wanting to be vegan, and other times they would experience their identity being ignored and avoided altogether. So in conclusion, both LGBTQ plus and vegan identities experience a lack of acceptance in similar spaces, and this lack of acceptance leads to similar negative outcomes in terms of social relationships, mental health, and even physical health, especially as it is affected by high levels of stress. In order to support individuals who may be struggling to feel accepted by their loved ones or the whole of society, it is imperative to understand how other aspects of their identity may magnify these effects. Along with making sure individuals can live safe and happy lives, it is important to understand various dimensions of human existence when attempting to usher about social change. Not only is social change at the expense of others ineffective, but it is also immoral and hypocritical. As one of my wonderful participants said, if we're allies for the animals, why are we not allies for each other? Why are we not being allies for everybody? Thank you. And if you have any further questions after this, my email is listed on the bottom of the slide.
Thank you so much, Mallorie. Very novel research and really interesting. We'd definitely like to know more about that. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so questions at the end, as we mentioned before, for any newcomers. And now we move on to Sarah Buck, who was awarded an MA in Anthrozoology from Exeter in 2021. And Sarah's presentation will be from tree hugger to eco-terrorist, the criminalisation of effective animal advocacy and the consequences for the modern human animals. Interesting. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Good morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you're zooming in from. And thank you most kindly for listening to this approximately 4 to 5 minute long talk. For brevity, more than human animals will be referred to just as animals from here on. I would also like to give listeners a trigger warning that I will be talking about intensive animal use, and I will also briefly mention animal slaughter in this talk. So what are ag-gag laws? Ag-gag laws, or agricultural gagging legislation, seeks to gag or silence whistleblowers of animal cruelty, abuse and food safety violations on factory farms and other hidden animal industries, such as research laboratories. Ag-gag laws initially criminalised videotaping inside of factory farms, but have since been expanded to those who may defame animal industries more generally. For example, an unaffiliated local resident, Amy Mayer, was charged under the Utah State ag-gag law for filming a meat packing facility from a public highway on her phone. She witnessed the illegal movement of the so-called downer cow with a forklift truck to the kill floor. The farm faced no legal recourse for the footage that Amy shot. Whilst this talk speaks mostly to a US context, other countries such as Canada, Australia and France have versions of ag-gag legislation under other names usually. So, however, animal advocates and whistleblowers are essential to bring systemic animal abuse to public attention. As intensive farms and laboratories are hidden from the public, what we know of the conditions for animals comes almost exclusively from undercover whistleblowers and activist imagery. Indeed, very little would have changed in the way of animal welfare reform in recent decades without them. Exposés of conditions inside of laboratories and farms made accessible to the public by whistleblowers caused moral shock and ultimately a public demand to improve animal welfare, such as in the famous US Hallmark Farms cases. So what are the consequences for the billions of animals within the animal industrial complex? It is generally accepted that animal welfare laws are insufficient and poorly enforced, particularly in farm, slaughterhouse and laboratory settings, where the incidences of animal abuse reporting are very low. Those who are found guilty of committing animal abuse offences face relatively light punitive measures, typically a fine or much less commonly a custodial prison sentence of up to 6 months. Conversely, those charged under ag-gag legislation could face on average 1 year in prison, a 100% increase simply for exposing animal abuse. In practice, ag-gag laws mean that the defamation of an animal economic enterprise trumps the pre-existing animal welfare legislation. Excuse me. Since silencing whistleblowers means that animals living in the industrial complexes are further invisibilized. Without public knowledge, animal industries are able to operate unchecked, leaving animals at an increased risk of abuse. Awareness raising is also essential to facilitate public discourse and the lobbying essential to improve conditions for animals. Sociologist Roger Yates asserted, in animal rights activism, tactics that are effective tend to be criminalized. My research concurs, ultimately arguing that peaceful activism is considered subversive and is quickly criminalized when it is found to be effective, that is, economically damaging to animal industries. This is highlighted by a number of cases where laws were quickly rushed through to gag activists and whistleblowers from releasing footage of farms. Legislation and media reframing means that once benign tree-hugging or bunny-hugging animal advocates have been rebranded as violent domestic eco-terrorists. Now, meaningful change for animals in industrial complexes can only be enacted by transgressing laws. In order to protect the financial interests of animal industrial complexes, under which animal bodies are packaged as units for sale, animals will always be subjugated. This research highlighted, therefore, a greater need to address the underlying problem of the status of animals as property and their place within the neoliberal political system to truly challenge systems which exploit animals. Thank you once again for taking the time to listen to this presentation, and thank you to all of the amazing organisers and other speakers for their fascinating contributions to this brilliant conference.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was really interesting. And we wrote a paper about something very similar recently, which I'm sure that Michelle or Chris would share in the chat later, but we'd love to chat to you about it more for sure. Apologies, but my computer has decided to freeze on this side, so I'll have to look at this side to introduce the next guest that we have. Laura, please let me know if I mispronounce your name, but we would like to welcome Laura Hiisivuori, who is a PhD researcher from the University of Helsinki. And Laura will be discussing whether we can recognize emotions of tigers, monkeys, and goats. Welcome, and I'll hand it over to you, Laura. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I share my screen. Maybe you can see it.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you. So as you say, I'm Laura Hiisivuori, and I come from University of Helsinki, Finland. We have there in Helsinki a small research project called Visualizing Animal Emotions, where we, as the name says, we study animal emotions and especially how we humans can recognize them. And then I just, yeah, and as you maybe know, emotions play an important role in animal welfare, but with humans, our humans' ability to identify those emotions seems to be limited, and we don't know yet which factors affect it. And so far, almost all studies have tested a recognition of domestic animals, and lastly, mainly our abilities with one species at a time. And that's why we use 3 species of non-domestic domestic animals in this our research first phase. We have monkey, tiger, and goat. And we asked participants to watch video clips of those animals' emotions and give a score of these 2-step scales, which is from bottom to up, calm to active, and from left to right, from positive to negative, sorry, from negative to positive. Okay, now I missed, but okay, maybe you can see the axis there. We got a huge amount of data, and now we have done our first analysis, and both of our preliminary hypotheses seems to be right. We assumed that arousal, so state of activity, was recognized better than emotional valence. Perhaps it was important in evolution to notice first arousal, so as not to be eaten, for example. And we assumed that monkeys' emotions were easier to identify compared to those of tiger tigers and goats, and that was true. And it makes sense because they are primates just like us, and we share many expressions, gestures, and so on. But this is very short first glimpse of our research, because we have, as I say, we had a huge amount of data, and I hope we have more to say by end of this year. So so far this was what I had to say. Thank you.
Yeah, very quick, but important subject. I mean, as somebody who's actually interested in knowing whether we can identify the emotions of shocks at some point in my research, I think it's very, very relevant for sure. Okay, so any questions for Laura, please put in the Padlet and we shall attend to them later. Right, okay, so Laurie Hoy is a PhD candidate at the University of Surrey, and her presentation looks at using social listening to explore human and dog experiences at UK dog festivals.
Hi everyone, I'm Laurie Hoy, and I'm here today to talk to you about some research I've just started related to human and dog experiences at UK dog festivals. And these are events that I've attended with my pup, Princess Buttercup, that you can see there on the left-hand side. When I refer to UK dog festivals, I'm talking about events that are specifically marketed as dog-friendly festivals where dogs can have fun, participate, and socialize, and people can shop, learn, and enjoy a day out with their dog. There's a range of activities and vendors available. In this research, I looked specifically at 4 different events that sometimes have 1 up to 7 events throughout the year. But these are Dogfest, Dogstable, Good Wolf, and All About Dog Show, which all take place in England. And here I just wanted to include some pictures from various dog festivals that I've attended with my dog, just so that you can kind of get an idea that it's in an open field. There are other people and dogs, but it's not super cramped. There are areas where dogs can relax, but dogs are always required to be on lead. So what is social listening? Well, it's the process of monitoring public online conversations about a chosen topic by collecting data from social platforms such as Twitter and forums like Mumsnet or Reddit. Social listening gives you the ability to take all of these conversations and then get meaningful insights and data out of them. And for this research, I partnered with a company called Brandwatch. So the first step in conducting this research was to work with Brandwatch to write a custom search query. So this included the steps of deciding which dog festivals to include, which sources of information we wanted to use, what additional parameters might be good to include or exclude, and then geo-restricting to the UK. Then Brandwatch itself had a time coverage restriction for me of the past 3 years and the data that they could provide me. Then once the search query was written, basically it was to then go look at the data, and that included looking at things like the volume, the content sources, what was being mentioned, and then to take that information to further refine the search query, because things came up about certain terms that were irrelevant, not what I was looking for, or someone might mention something that would be of interest that was added to the search query. And then after working on refining that search query further, it's possible to create custom dashboards, which I did, allowing me to dive a bit deeper into the results. Next, just to share a little bit about the data. So from the search query that was written, a total of 6,880 mentions were gathered, and that was coming from close to 3,000 unique authors. Of those authors, 65% were female, and 85% of those mentions were coming from Twitter, and that has to do with what's in the public domain and what is not. But you can see the dashboards provide all kinds of different information, but one option is the word cloud, which can kind of just give you first a rough idea of types of things that are being said. So just a bit on the results. When it came to the mentions, joy was the most common classification on the emotions. The sentiment was 42% positive, with 5% being negative, but these were related to concerns about safety or operational issues, and about 53% of the mentions were neutral, and that's because they related to promotion, people saying they were attending, or news stories. Some examples of the social media posts. There's all kinds of topics, but you can see the individual posts, and they'll range from anything about promoting the event and people being concerned about it being too hot, to the enjoyment that people believe that their dogs had of the day, such as meeting other dogs or enjoying participating in the events. So a lot of people talk about themselves, for example, being dog mad, or how much of a blast they had, how much they think their dog enjoyed it, or how it was such a good day out that their dogs were quite tired. Although, of course, there are the negative comments about sometimes the other attendees at the event. So next steps will be to further refine the search query and really dig into the data through the dashboards and search for themes. And then the next steps would be to collect data. And I'd like to conduct both qualitative and quantitative research, try to get a better understanding of the experience of the people and the dogs at these events. And the ultimate goal is to provide actionable solutions to ensure positive experiences at these dog festivals for both people and dogs. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions or suggestions that you have.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I know I'm speaking to you live rather than to the recording, but that was really very necessary research. As somebody who sees my husband's black dog lying in the sun quite often, and them then going off on walks, I do often wonder how much dogs actually enjoy the situations that their owners put them into, or their guardians, I should say.